On the other hand, Marla said softly. Charlie looked at her. She was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Charlie put an arm around her. "I know," she said. The sound system came on suddenly with a whine that slowly faded. 4 people walked on stage. A heavyset man in a suit who went straight to the microphone, an elderly woman, and a couple, a man and a woman. The man in the suit stepped up to the podium, and the elderly woman sat down in one of the 4 chairs. The couple stayed back, but they did not sit. Charlie knew they must be Michael's parents, but she did not recognize them. When she was young, they had just been parents, a species that was, for the most part, unremarkable. She realized suddenly that she didn't even know their names. Michael's parents had not gone out of their way to interact with their son's friends, and Charlie had literally spoken to them as Michael's mom and Michael's dad, as if those were appropriate forms of address. The man at the podium introduced himself as the school's principal. He said a few things about loss and community and the fleeting preciousness of youth. He talked briefly about Michael's kindness, his artistic talent, and the impression he made, even as a small child, on everyone he met. It was true, Charlie reflected. Michael had been an unusually charismatic child. He wasn't exactly a leader, but they all found themselves wanting to please him, to make him smile. And so they often did the things they knew he wanted to do, just to make him happy. The principal finished and introduced Michael's parents, Joan and Donald Brooks. They stood at the podium awkwardly, each looking from face to face in the crowd, as if they were not sure how they had gotten here. Finally, Joan stepped forward. "It feels strange to be up here," was the first thing she said, and a murmur of something like agreement swept quietly through the crowd. "We are so grateful to all of you for coming, especially those of you who came from out of town." She looked directly at the front row, talking to Charlie and the others. "Some of Michael's friends have come from all over, and I think that is a testament to who he was, that 10 years later, with your lives on new paths, moving on to a whole new stage of life." So close to the stage, Charlie could see she was about to cry, tears wavering in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "We are grateful you are here. We wanted to give Michael a legacy with this scholarship, but it is clear that he has already left one, all on his own." Marla grabbed Charlie's hand, and Charlie squeezed back. "I want to say," Joan continued, "something about the families who are not here. As we all know, Michael was not the only child lost during those terrible few months." She read out 4 more names, 2 girls and 2 boys. Charlie glanced at Marla. They all knew there had been other children, but Michael's death had loomed so great in all their lives that they had never even talked about the other victims. Now Charlie felt a pang of guilt. To someone, those little girls and boys had been as vital as Michael. To someone, their losses had meant the end of the world. She closed her eyes for a moment. "I can't mourn everyone," she thought. "No one can." Joan was still talking. "Although their families have moved on to other places, those young boys and girls will always have a place in our hearts. Now I would like to call to speak a young man who was particularly close to my son. Carlton, if you would." They all watched in surprise as Carlton stood and climbed up behind the podium. Joan hugged him tightly and stayed close behind him as he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He cleared his throat, looking over the heads of the crowd, then crumpled the paper up again and put it back in his pocket. "I don't remember as much about Michael as I should," he said finally. "Too much of those years is a blur. I know we met when we were still in diapers, but I don't remember that, thankfully." There was a soft titter through the crowd. I do know that as far back as I have memories, Michael is in them. I remember playing superheroes, drawing, which he was much better at than me, and as we got older, I remember, well, playing superheroes and drawing. What I really remember, though, is that my days were always more exciting when he was in them. He was smarter than me. He was the one always coming up with new ideas, new ways to get in trouble. Sorry about those lamps, by the way, Mrs. Brooks. If I had jumped the way Michael said, I probably would only have broken one. Donald laughed, a gulping, desperate sound. Charlie shifted uncomfortably and pulled her hand from Marla's with an apologetic half-smile. Their grief, naked, was too much to watch. It was raw, an open wound, and she could not stand to look. Carlton came back down to sit with them. Michael's grandmother spoke, and then his father, who had recovered enough to share a memory of taking his son to his first art class. He told the crowd about the scholarship for a graduating senior who has demonstrated both excellence and passion in the arts, and announced the winner of the first one, Anne Park, a slight Korean girl who came quickly up to the stage to accept her plaque and hugs from Michael's parents. It must have been strange for Anne, Charlie thought, her honor so overshadowed by its origins. But then, she realized, Anne must have known Michael too, however much in passing. After the ceremony, they went to say hello to Michael's parents, hugging them and making sounds of condolence. What do you say to someone who has lost a child? Can it be any easier? Can 10 years make a difference? Or do they wake up each morning as fresh with grief as the day he died? On a long cafeteria table by the stage, pictures and cards were collecting slowly. People had brought flowers, notes to Michael's parents or to him, things they remembered, things they wished they had said. Charlie went over and browsed through the notes. They were pictures of her and the others as well as of Michael. It shouldn't have surprised her. They were all together constantly, as a group or in rotating groups of 2 and 3. She saw herself in the middle of a pose. Michael, John, and she, all covered in mud, with Jessica beside them, still perfectly clean, refusing to go near them. Charlie smiled. That looks about right. In another, a 5-year-old Marla struggled to support the weight of her newborn little brother, with Lamar peering suspiciously at the tiny thing over her shoulder. Some of Michael's drawings were there, too. Crayon scribbles professionally, incongruously framed. Charlie picked one up, a drawing of what she supposed was a T-Rex stomping through a city. It was actually, she realized now, almost amazing how talented he was. While she and the others were scribbling stick figures, Michael's drawings looked realistic. Sort of. That's really good, John said over her shoulder. Charlie startled. You scared me, she said. Sorry. Charlie looked back at the drawing. Whatever it was better than she could draw now. Suddenly, her chest tightened, gripped with loss and rage. It wasn't just that Michael died young. It was what that truly meant. He had been stopped in his tracks. Years, decades of life snatched and torn violently from him. She felt herself well up with youthful indignation as if she were a child again, wanting only to whine, "It's not fair." Taking a deep breath, Charlie set the picture back down on the table and turned away. The gathering was continuing, but she needed to leave. She caught Marla's eye, and Marla, as scarily intuitive as always, nodded and caught Lamar's sleeve. From their various vantage points, they all headed for the parking lot. No one seemed to notice their departure, which made sense. Except for Carlton, they were all strangers here. In the lot, they stopped by Marla's car. She had somehow called down a miracle and found a space right next to the school. "Can I play my game now?" Jason said immediately, and Marla found her keys in her purse and handed them over. Don't drive away, she warned. Suddenly, Marla grabbed her brother and pulled him close, hugging him to her for a long minute. "Geez, I'm only going to the car," he muttered when she let him go. "Yeah, maybe I should let you drive away," she said, giving him a little push. She cleared her throat. "So are we going to Freddy's?" she said. They all looked at one another. "Yeah," Charlie said. "I think we should." Somehow, following this, going back to Freddy's seemed like more than a game. It felt right. "Let's meet there at sunset," she said. "Hey, Jessica, can you catch a ride with the guys or something? I'm gonna go for a walk." "You can come with us," Marla said. "I promised Jason I'd take him to the movies." Charlie headed down the road without waiting to hear the rest of the discussion. A dozen feet from the lot, she realized she was being followed. She turned around. "John? Do you mind if I come? You're going to your old house, right?" "How did you know that?" "It's the only interesting thing out this way. Anyway, I went to see my old place, too. It was painted blue, and there was a garden in the yard. It was weird. I know it wasn't blue when I lived there, but I couldn't remember what color it was supposed to be. Everything's so different." Charlie didn't say anything. She wasn't even sure she wanted John to come with her. Her house, her father's house. It was private. She thought of the first time John had seen the toys, his fascination, an interest that was all his, that had nothing to do with pleasing her. She relented. "Okay, you can come." "Is it—" He hesitated. "Is it different?" "It's really not," Charlie said. It wasn't quite true, but she wasn't sure how to explain the thing that had changed. They walked together for the better part of 3 miles, away from town and down old roads, first paved, then gravel. As they neared the place, they left the roads, ascending the steep incline of a hill overrun with brush and trees that should have been trimmed or cut down ages ago. 3 rooftops peeked over the leaves, scattered widely over the hill, but no one had lived in these houses in a long time. At last, they walked up the driveway, and John stopped short, staring up at the house. "I thought it would be less intimidating," he said softly. Impatient, Charlie took his arm for a second and pulled him away, leading them around the side of the house. It was one thing for him to be here with her, but she was not quite ready to let someone else inside. She wasn't even sure she wanted to go inside again anyway. He followed her without protest, as if aware that they were in her territory, and she would decide where they went. The property was large, more than a lawn. There were woods surrounding the wide space of the backyard, and as a child, Charlie had often felt like she was in her own little realm, ruler of all she surveyed. The grass had gone wild, weeds growing feral and up to their knees. They walked the perimeter. John peered into the woods, and Charlie was struck by her old childhood fear, like something out of a fairy tale. "Don't go into the woods alone, Charlotte," her father warned. It was not sinister, just a parent's warning. Don't get lost. Like telling her not to cross the street without holding someone's hand, or not to touch the stove when it was hot. But Charlie took it more seriously. She knew from her storybooks, as all children did, that the woods contained wolves and more dangerous things. She caught John's sleeve. "Don't," she said, and he pulled back from the woods, not asking why. Instead, he went to a tree in the middle of the yard and put a hand on it. "Remember that tree?" he asked, smiling, something a little wicked in his voice. "Of course," Charlie said, walking over. "It's been here longer than I ever was." But he was looking at her, waiting for more, and suddenly she remembered. It had been a sunny day, springtime. They were 6 years old, maybe. John was visiting, and they were playing hide-and-seek, half supervised by Charlie's father, who was in his garage workshop, absorbed in his machines. The door was open so he would notice if someone screamed, but short of that, the outdoors was their own. John counted to 10, eyes covered, facing the tree that was home base. The yard was wide and open. There were not many places to hide, so Charlie, buoyed up by the excitement of the game, dared to hide beyond the forbidden edge of the woods, just barely past the tree line. John searched the other places first, behind her father's car, in the corner where one part of the garage jutted out, the space beneath the porch where a child could just barely crawl. He realized where she must be, and Charlie braced herself to run as he began to walk the edges of the yard, darting into the woods and out again, looking behind trees. When at last he found her, she took off, tearing across the lawn to the home base tree. He was just behind her, so close he could almost touch her, and she sped on, staying just out of reach. She hit the tree, almost slamming into it, and John was right behind her, bumping into her a second later, too fast to stop. They were both giggling hysterically, and then they stopped at the same moment, still gasping to catch their breath. "Hey, Charlotte," John said, stressing her name in the mocking tone he always used. "Don't call me that," Charlie said automatically. "You ever see grown-ups kiss?" He picked up a stick and started digging at the tree bark, like he was more interested in that than in her answer. Charlie shrugged. "Yeah, I guess so." "Want to try it?" He still wasn't looking at her. His face was streaked with dirt, like it often was, and his hair was sticking out in all directions, a twig caught in it above his forehead. "Gross," Charlie said, wrinkling her nose. Then, after a moment, "Yeah, okay." John dropped the stick and leaned toward her, his hands behind his back. Charlie closed her eyes, waiting, still not entirely sure what she was supposed to do. "Charlotte?" It was her father. Charlie jumped back. John's face was so close to hers that she banged into him with her forehead. "Ow!" he yelled, clapping a hand to his nose. Charlie's father came around the side of the tree. "What are you up to? John?" He pried John's fingers away from his nose. "You're not bleeding. You'll be fine," he said. "Charlotte, closer to the house, please." He then pointed his finger, directing them forward. "John, it looks like your mom is here anyway." He walked ahead of them, toward the driveway where her car had just pulled in. "Yeah, okay." John trotted off toward the driveway, turning once to wave at Charlie. He was grinning like something wonderful had happened, although Charlie was not quite sure what it was. "Oh my," Charlie said now, covering her face, sure it was bright red. When she looked up again, John was grinning that same satisfied 6-year-old grin. "You know, my nose still hurts when it rains," he said, touching a finger to it. "It does not," Charlie said. She leaned back against the tree. "I can't believe you tried to kiss me. We were 6. Charlie stared at him accusingly. "Even the littlest heart wants what it wants," John said in a mock romantic voice, but there was an edge of something real in it, something not well enough hidden. Charlie realized, suddenly, that he was standing very close to her. "Let's go see your dad's workshop," John said abruptly, too loud, and Charlie nodded. "Okay." She regretted it as she said it. She did not want to open the workshop door. She closed her eyes, still leaning against the tree. She could still see it. It was all she could see when she thought of that place. The twitching, malformed metal skeleton in its dark corner, with its wrenching shutters and its blistering silver eyes. The image welled up in her head until it was all there was, The memory radiated a cutting anguish, but she did not know who it belonged to the thing, to her father, or to herself. Charlie felt a hand on her shoulder and opened her eyes. It was John, frowning at her like he was worried. "Charlie, are you okay?" "No." "Yes," she said. "Come on, let's go see what's in the workshop." It was not locked, and there was no real reason it should be, Charlie thought. Her eyes went first to the dark corner. The figure was not there. There was a weathered apron hanging in its place, the one her father had worn for soldering, and his goggles next to it. But there was no sign of that uncanny presence. Charlie should have felt relief, but she didn't, only a vague unease. She looked around. There seemed to be almost nothing left of the workshop. The benches were there, where her father had assembled and tweaked his inventions, but the materials, the blueprints, and the half-finished robots that were once crammed onto every surface had disappeared. Where are they? Had her aunt had them carted away to a junkyard to rust and crumble among other discarded, useless things? Or had her father done it himself, so no one else would have to? The concrete floor was littered here and there with scraps. Whoever had done the cleanup had not been thorough. Charlie knelt and picked up an oddly shaped scrap of wood, then a small circuit board. She turned it over. Whose brain were you? She wondered. But it did not matter, not really. It was battered and worn, the etched copper too badly scratched to repair, even if someone wanted to. "Charlie," John said from across the workshop. He was in the dark corner. If the skeleton had been there, it could have reached out to touch him. But it's not there. "What?" "Come see what I found." Charlie went. John was standing beside her father's toolbox, and he stepped away as she came over, giving her space. Charlie knelt down before it. It looked as if it had just been polished. It was made of dark, stained wood, glossy with some kind of lacquer. She opened it gently. Charlie picked up an awl from the top tray and held it for a moment, the rounded wooden handle fitting into the palm of her hand as if it had been made for her to use. Not that she knew how. The last time she had picked it up, she could barely fit her fingers around its base. She picked up the tools one after another, lifting them from their places. The toolbox had wooden spaces carved out to fit the precise shape of each item. All the tools were polished and clean, their wooden handles smooth, and their metal unrusted. They looked as though they had been used just that morning, wiped down and put away meticulously, like someone still cared for them. She looked at them with a fierce, unexpected joy, as if something she had fought for was returned to her. But her joy felt wrong, misplaced. Looking at her father's things set her off balance. Something in the world was not as it should be. Seized suddenly with an unfounded fear, she thrust the awl back into its place in the box, dropping it like something burning. She closed the lid, but she did not stand. Memory overtook her, and she closed her eyes, not fighting against it. Her feet were wedged in the dirt, and two large and callous hands covered her eyes. Suddenly there was a bright light, and Charlie squinted, squirming impatiently to see what was before her. 3 complete and gleaming figures towered over her, motionless, the sun reflecting off every edge and contour. They were blinding to behold. "What do you think?" She heard the question but could not answer it. Her eyes hadn't adjusted. The 3 masses of standing metal all looked similar in structure, but Charlie had grown accustomed to seeing more than was there, imagining the final result. For a long time now there had been 3 empty suits, hanging like carcasses from a rafter in the attic. Charlie knew that they had a special purpose, and now she understood what it was. 2 long beams protruded from the top of the head of one of the hulking masses. The head itself was solid and skull-like. The beams looked as if they had been violently thrust there.
"That's the rabbit,"
Charlie squealed, proud of herself. "You aren't scared of him?" the voice asked.
"Of course not. He looks like Theodore."
"Theodore, that's right." The figure in the middle was more clearly rendered. Its face was chiseled, its features distinct. It was clearly a bear, and a single metal beam stuck out from the top of its head as well. Charlie was puzzled for a moment, then smiled.
"For the top hat,"
she said with confidence. The last form was perhaps the most frightening. A long metal clamp protruded from its empty face, in the place where a mouth might go. It was holding something on a platter, a metal structure that looked like a jaw, wires running like strewn spaghetti up and down the frame and in and out of sockets.
"That one's scary,"
she admitted hesitantly. "Well, this part will look like a cupcake." Her father pressed down on the top, and the jaw snapped shut, making Charlie jump, then giggle. Suddenly, her laughter stopped. She had been so distracted she'd forgotten. "I'm not supposed to stand here. I don't stand here." Her hands were trembling. How could she have forgotten? The corner. She looked at the ground, unable to lift her eyes, unable to move. One of her shoes was untied. There was a screw next to her foot, and an old piece of tape, opaque with dirt. There was something behind her. "Charlie?" It was John. "Charlie!" She looked up at him. "Sorry, just lost. This place." She stood and took a step forward, positioning herself in the place she remembered. She glanced behind her as if the memory might manifest. The corner was empty. There was nothing. She knelt again and put her hand on the ground, fishing around until she found a small screw in the bare dirt. She palmed it, then looked closer. There were small holes in the ground, exposed when she moved the loose dirt. Charlie ran her fingers over them, thoughtful. "Charlie, I have to tell you something." There was something urgent in John's voice. Charlie looked around the workshop and stood up. "Can we go outside?" she said. "I can't breathe in here." "Yeah, of course," he said. He followed her out into the yard and back to the hide-and-seek tree. She was tired, a wrung-out exhaustion deep inside. She would be fine in a minute, but she wanted a place that held only silly childhood memories. She sat down in the grass, leaned against the trunk, and waited for John to talk. He settled himself cross-legged in front of her, a little stiffly, smoothing his pants, and she laughed. "Are you worried about getting dirty?" "Times change," he said with a wry smile. "What do you have to tell me?" she asked, and his face grew serious. "I should have said something a long time ago," he said. When something happens like that, you don't trust your memory, don't trust your own mind." "What are you talking about?" Charlie asked. "Sorry." He took a deep breath. "I saw someone that night, the night Michael disappeared." "What do you mean?" "Remember when we were sitting at the table by the stage and the animals started going crazy?" "I remember," Charlie said. It had been bizarre, their movements upsetting. They were moving too fast, bending and spinning, cycling through their limited, programmed moves over and over. They seemed frantic, panicked. Charlie was mesmerized. She should have been afraid of them, but she was not. She saw, in their juddering motion, a kind of desperation. She was reminded, for a moment, of dreams of running, dreams when the world depended on her going just 10 steps forward, yet her body could only move in slow motion. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Chaotically, violently, The animatronic animals on stage thrashed robotic limbs in all directions, their eyes rolling in their sockets. "What did you see?" Charlie said to John now, shaking her head as though she could rid it of the image. "There was another mascot," he said. "A bear." "Freddy," Charlie interrupted without thinking. "No, not Freddy." John took her hands as if trying to calm them both, but he let go before he spoke again. "It was standing right near us, next to our table, but it wasn't looking at the stage like everyone else was. That technician came over, remember? And even he was just watching the animatronics. I guess he was trying to figure out what was happening. I looked over at the mascot, and it looked back at me." He stopped. "John, what?" Charlie said impatiently. "Then the animatronics on stage stopped moving, and I looked over at them, and when we all turned back around, Michael was gone, and so was the mascot." Charlie stared at him in disbelief. "You saw the kidnapper," she said. "I didn't know what I saw," John said. "It was all chaos. I didn't even think about it. I didn't make the connection. It was just another animal at Freddy's. I didn't think about who might have been inside it. I was a kid, you know? You figure that the grown-ups already know everything you know." "Yeah," Charlie said. "I know. Do you remember anything? What the person looked like?" John was staring up at the sky, as if he were seeing something Charlie could not. "Yes," he said. His voice was deliberate, steady. "The eyes. They were all I could see. But I still see them sometimes, like they're right there in front of me. They were dead." "What?" "They were dead, just dull and flat, like they still moved and blinked and saw, but whatever was behind them had died a long time ago." He fell silent. It was growing dark. There was a bright, almost unnatural streak of pink across the western sky, and Charlie shivered. "We should go get the car," she said. "It's almost time to meet everyone." "Yeah," John said, but he didn't move right away, still staring into the distance. "John, we have to go," Charlie said. He seemed to come back to himself slowly. "Yeah," he said. "We should go." He got up and brushed off his pants, then grinned at Charlie. "Race you?" he said and took off running. Charlie chased after him, her feet pounding the asphalt, and her arms swinging free. Chapter 4. Charlie and John were the last ones to the mall. When they pulled up, the others were gathered tight in a circle in front of Marla's car, as if sharing a conspiracy. "Come on," Marla said before they had walked all the way to the group. She was bouncing on the balls of her feet as if she were ready to run for the door of the abandoned building. Everyone but Charlie and John had changed their clothing, wearing jeans and t-shirts, things more suited for exploration, and she had a brief moment of feeling out of place. "At least I didn't wear a dress," Charlie thought. "Let's go," she said. Marla's impatience seemed to be contagious, or maybe it just gave Charlie an excuse to let her real feelings come to the surface. She wanted to show Freddy's off to the others. "Hold up," John said. He looked at Jessica. "Did you explain everything?" "I told them about the night guard," she said. "What else is there?" He looked thoughtful for a moment. "I guess nothing," he said. "I brought more lights," Carlton said and held up 3 flashlights of varying sizes. He tossed one to Jason, a small one with an elastic headband attached. Jason turned it on, fixed it around his head, and began moving enthusiastically in waves and circles, making the light bob and dance. "Shh," Charlie said, even though he was not making any sound. "Jason," Marla whispered.
Turn it off. We can't attract attention, remember?
Jason gleefully ignored them, spinning off into the parking lot like a top.
I told him if he's not good, he has to wait in the car, Marla told Charlie quietly. But now that we're here, I'm not sure which place is creepier.
She eyed the bare branches overhead raging in the wind, threatening to reach down and grab them.
Or we can feed him to Foxy.
Charlie winked. She went to her trunk and hefted out the police flashlight, but she did not turn it on. Instead, Carlton switched on two of his smaller lights and handed one to Jessica. They headed into the mall. Knowing where they were going and what was waiting for them there, Charlie, John, Jessica, and Carlton moved through the empty spaces with a sense of purpose, but the others kept stopping to look around.
Come on,
Jessica said impatiently as Lamar gazed up at the atrium dome.
You can see the moon,
he said and pointed. Next to him, Marla nodded, mimicking his posture.
It's beautiful,
she said, although she could not see it. From a distance, they heard footsteps echo in the emptiness.
Hey, over here,
John hissed, and they hurried as quietly as they could. They could not run for fear of making noise, and so they walked, fast but careful, hugging the walls. They entered the black void of the department store, creeping along in the shadows until they reached the break in the wall. John held back the hanging plastic obscuring the opening as the others maneuvered around the scaffolding. Jason was slow, and Charlie put a hand on his shoulder to hurry him up. As she steered him to the opening, a strong beam of light swept into the room, scanning up and down the walls. They all ducked through the plastic and ran down the alley to where the others were crouched down against the wall.
He saw us,
Jason whispered, alarmed, running straight to his sister.
Shh,
Marla said. They waited. Charlie was next to John this time, and after that moment by the tree, whatever it was, she was very, almost uncomfortably, aware of him. They were not quite touching, but she seemed to know exactly where he was, an awkward sixth sense. She glanced at him, but his eyes were fixed on the opening to the hallway. They could hear the guard's footsteps now, clear in the empty space, each one distinct. He was moving slowly, deliberately. Charlie closed her eyes, listening. She could tell where he was from the sound, she thought, getting closer, then farther, crisscrossing the open room like he was hunting for something. The steps came right up to the entrance of the alley and stopped. They all held their breaths.
He knows,
Charlie thought. But the steps started again, and she opened her eyes and saw the light receding. He was going away. They waited, still motionless, until they could no longer hear the tapping of his hard-soled shoes. She and John both stumbled a little as they stood, and she realized they had been leaning against each other without realizing it. She didn't look at him. Instead, she set to work taking the heaviest things off the wooden shelf.
Will I be needing this?
Lamar asked, as Charlie handed him a bucket with a saw sticking out of it.
We have to move the shelf, Jessica said. Come on.
Jessica, Charlie, Carlton, and John got back into place and moved the shelf. Lamar tried to find a place to help, but there was not really room. Marla just waited.
I'm better suited to supervising,
she said when Charlie mock glared at her. This time the screaming of the metal door was not as loud, as if it no longer protested their entrance quite so strongly. Still, Marla and Jason covered their ears.
You think that's not going to bring the guard?
Marla hissed. Charlie shrugged.
Didn't last time,
she said.
I know he saw us,
Jason said again. The others ignored him.
His flashlight went right over me,
he insisted.
It's really okay, Jason, Jessica said. We thought he saw us last night too, but it was fine.
Jason looked dubious, and Lamar bent over to his eye level.
"Hey, Jason," he said. "What do you think the guard would do if he saw us?"
Shoot us?
Jason whimpered, eyeing Lamar warily.
"Worse,"
Lamar said gravely.
"Community service."
Jason wasn't sure what it meant, but he held his eyes open wide as though it was something terrible.
Will you leave him alone?
Marla whispered, amused.
He didn't see us,
Jason reassured himself, though clearly unconvinced. Charlie turned on the big light and shone it down the hallway.
Oh my!
Marla gasped as the first light streaked across the interior of the pizzeria. Suddenly it became real, and her face flushed with awe and fear. They went in one by one. The temperature seemed to drop as soon as they walked into the hall, and Charlie shivered, but she did not feel ill at ease. She knew where they were now, and she knew what they would find. When they got to the dining room, Carlton spread his arms wide and twirled.
"Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza,"
he said in a booming announcer's voice. Jessica giggled, but the melodrama did not actually seem out of place. Marla and Lamar gaped at the room, awestruck. Charlie set the large flashlight on the ground, the beam facing up, and it lit up the main room in a dim and ghostly illumination.
"Cool,"
Jason said. His eyes fell on the merry-go-round, and he raced for it and jumped onto the back of a pony before anyone could stop him. He was too big for it, his sneakers dangling all the way to the ground. Charlie smiled.
How do I make it go?
He shouted.
"Sorry, buddy,"
John said. Jason climbed off, disappointed.
"The arcade is over this way,"
Carlton said, motioning to anyone who might follow. Marla went with him, while Jason fiddled hopefully with the carousel's control box. Lamar had walked to the stage and was standing transfixed, staring up at the animals. Charlie went over to him.
"I can't believe they're still here,"
he said as she walked up.
Yeah,
she said.
"I'd forgotten this was a real place."
Lamar smiled, for the first time resembling the little boy Charlie had once known. Charlie smiled back. There was something surreal about the place. She had certainly never told any of her school friends about it. She would not have known where to begin. Worse, she would not have known where to stop. Jessica poked her head out from the retracted curtain at the side of the main stage, and they both startled.
"What are you doing?"
Lamar asked.
Exploring, she said. There's nothing back here but a bunch of wires, though.
She disappeared into the folds of cloth again. After a moment, they heard a thud as she jumped to the ground, and she came strolling over.
"Do they work?"
Lamar asked, pointing at the animals.
I don't know,
Charlie said. Truthfully, she had no idea how they worked. They had always just been, set to intermittent life by whatever alchemy her father performed in his workshop. It doesn't look like anything is missing. They should work, she reluctantly added, though in her head she questioned the idea of trying to turn them on.
Hey!
Jessica exclaimed. She was kneeling by the stairs to the stage.
Everybody come here now.
Charlie went over, and Lamar followed. What is it? Charlie asked.
Look,
Jessica said, shining her little light. Though well hidden along the grain of the wood, there was a door inset into the wall of the stage. How did we not see that? Charlie wondered.
"We weren't looking,"
John said, staring intently at the small door. The whole group had gathered, and now Jessica looked around at them with a grin, put her hand on the little doorknob, and pulled. Magically, it opened. The door revealed a small, sunken room. Jessica shone the light around it. It was full of equipment. One wall was covered in TV screens.
"Must be CCTV,"
Lamar said.
come on.
Jessica handed her flashlight to Charlie and swung her legs through the door. There was one deep step leading down into the room, which was no bigger than a large refrigerator turned on its side.
That's a little too cramped for me. I'll keep looking around out here.
John saluted, then turned as though to stand guard. This is like a clown car, Marla remarked as she jostled against Charlie. The space was too cramped for all of them, but they crowded together. Jason sat on the step, feeling more comfortable by the exit. There were 8 of the television screens across the wall, each with its own little panel of buttons and knobs, and sticking out beneath them was a panel, almost a table, covered in buttons. They were large and black, unlabeled, and spaced in an irregular series. The other wall was blank except for a single large switch by the door.
What's this do?
Jason said and put his hand on the switch. He hesitated just long enough for someone to stop him, then pulled it. The lights came on.
What?
Carlton looked to the others frantically. They all stared at one another in confused silence. Jason climbed up and poked his head out into the main room.
They're on out here, too. Some of them, at least,
he said too loudly.
Why is there power?
Jessica whispered, reaching over Jason to pull the door closed again.
How is that possible? Charlie said. This place hasn't been open in 10 years.
Cool. Marla leaned forward, studying the monitors as though expecting some sort of answer to be revealed.
Turn on the TVs,
Jason said suddenly.
I can't reach.
Jessica flipped on the first TV, and static crackled across the screen.
Nothing?
Charlie asked impatiently.
Just a sec.
She twisted a dial, wiggling it back and forth until an image emerged. It was the stage, centered on Bonnie. The other animals weren't visible. Jessica turned on the rest of the TVs, adjusting them until the pictures became clear, although most were still poorly lit.
They still work,
Charlie said, almost under her breath.
Maybe,
Jessica said.
Hey, someone go out there. See if the camera is live.
Okay, Marla said after a brief hesitation, wriggling her way to the exit and awkwardly climbing over Jason. A moment later, she appeared on camera, on stage beside Bonnie. Marla waved. She appeared multicolored as the stage lights bathed her in purple, green, and yellow from different sides.
Can you see me?
She asked.
Yeah,
Carlton shouted. Lamar was staring at the buttons.
What do these do?
He said with a wicked grin, pressing one. Marla screamed.
Marla, are you okay?
Charlie shouted.
What happened?
Marla was standing still on the stage, but she had backed away from Bonnie and was staring at him as if he might bite.
He moved,
Marla yelled.
Bonnie moved. What did you do? Marla,
Jessica yelled, laughing.
It's okay. We pushed a button.
Lamar pressed the button again, and they all watched the screen this time. Sure enough, Bonnie turned stiffly to one side. He pressed it again, and the rabbit swiveled back to face the absent audience again.
Try another one,
Carlton said.
Go ahead,
Lamar said and climbed out of the little room to join Marla on stage. He crouched down to inspect Bonnie's feet.
They're attached to a swiveling panel, he called.
Yeah?
Jessica called back, not really listening. Carlton started pressing buttons as the rest of them watched the cameras. After a moment, Charlie left the room as well.
It's too stuffy in here,
she explained. Jessica's perfume and Carlton's hair gel, both of which smelled nice enough out in the open, were starting to form a sickly miasma. She stepped out into the open to watch them experiment with the animals on stage. Most of the dining room was still dark. There were 3 colored spotlights suspended from the ceiling, aiming beams of purple, yellow, and green at the stage. The animals were cast now in unnatural colors, and dust in the beams of light shone like tiny stars, so many that it was difficult to see through them. The floor beneath the long tables was dusted with glitter that had fallen from the party hats, and as she looked around, she noticed again the drawings that lined the walls of the place, all at the height of children's eyes. They had always been there, and Charlie wondered now where her father had gotten the first ones when the restaurant opened. Had he used her own childish scribblings, or had he made them himself and stuck them up, forgeries to encourage actual children to display their art? The thought of her father hunched over his workbench, gripping an unsteady crayon with hands accustomed to manipulating microchips, made her want to giggle. She noticed the flashlight still on in the center of the room and went to switch it off. "Don't waste the battery," she said in her head, in chorus with Aunt Jen's voice. She turned her attention to the stage. It looked like the others had gotten Chica and Bonnie to go through a series of small, specific movements. They could each swivel their entire bodies back and forth, and their hands, feet, and heads could be moved in various directions, but each movement was separate. Charlie went back to the control room and stuck her head in. "Can you make them do the dance?" she asked. "I don't know how," Carlton said, leaning back away from the monitors. "All of this must have been used to program the dances. I don't think someone was in here manually controlling everything during the shows." He shook his head with certainty. "That would have been impossible." "Huh," Charlie said. "Everyone quiet," Marla called out, and they all fell silent. For a long moment there was no sound. Then Lamar said, "What?" Marla frowned, tilting her head to the side, listening for something. "I thought I heard something," she said finally. "It was like pings of a music box." Her mouth barely moved as she spoke. "It's gone." "Why isn't Freddie moving?" Charlie asked. "I don't know," Carlton said. "I can't find the controls for him." Jessica said, tapping the monitors. "These cameras don't show the whole place." Charlie peered at them, but they were mixed up, in no logical order. She couldn't piece together a picture of the whole restaurant. "There's 3 cameras on the stage, 1 on each animal, but there should be 1 on the whole thing," Jessica was saying. "There's the entrance to the kitchen, but not the kitchen itself. And you can't see the hallway and the room with the little stage we were at last night." "Maybe the cameras are just in the main room," Carlton suggested. "Nope," said Jessica. "There are cameras everywhere out there." "So?" Carlton said. "So there's got to be another control room," Jessica said triumphantly. "Maybe down the hall by the other stage." Charlie went back out into the main room again. She was feeling restless, less excited by the discoveries than the others, though she was not sure why. She watched the stage. Carlton was still playing with the buttons, Bonnie and Chica jerking in small, disjointed motions, as Freddie Fazbear remained motionless, his eyes half closed and his mouth slack, slightly open. "Hey," Lamar said suddenly. "Marla, the music. I hear it now." Everyone was silent again. Then Marla shook her head. "Creepy," she said, more excited this time, rubbing her hands together as though they were sharing campfire stories. Lamar looked thoughtfully at Freddie. "Let's go find the other control room," Jessica said, emerging with a determined look on her face. "Okay." Marla jumped from the stage to join them, and they started scanning the rest of the stage, looking for a second door. "I'm staying in here," Jason called from the first room. "This is so cool." Chica swiveled back and forth rapidly on the stage as he pushed her button repeatedly. Lamar went to join Jason. "Okay, my turn," he said, leaning on the door. He went in, not waiting for Jason's response. Charlie stayed where she was, still staring at Freddie, frozen in the middle of his act. John came up next to her, and she felt a flash of irritation. She did not want to be cajoled into joining in the search. He stood there for a moment, looking at Freddie, then leaned in close to her and whispered, "I'm counting to 100. You'd better hide." Surprised out of her thoughts, she looked at him for a moment, her irritation broken. He winked at her, then covered his eyes. It was absurd. It was childish. And in that moment, it was the only thing she wanted to do. Slightly giddy, Charlie took off, looking for a place to hide. Jason pushed the series of buttons again with increasing frustration. "I'm bored now," he announced. "How can you be bored?" Lamar said, wide-eyed. "They aren't working anymore." Jason continued to press buttons, no longer watching the monitors. Lamar studied the monitor. Bonnie's head was up and turned to the side, his eyes appearing to watch the camera. "Well, go find your sister then," he told Jason. "I don't need her permission to be bored." Impatiently, Jason climbed up and out of the control room. "Everyone is so sensitive," Lamar muttered, suddenly realizing he was alone in the control room. He climbed out, but Jason was already gone. Jessica was leading the exploration party, heading toward the little stage they had discovered the night before. Marla looked back and saw Jason skipping to catch up just before they disappeared into the long hall. "Hey, be careful," she called over her shoulder as Jason branched off in his own direction. Lamar caught up to the group and followed them on their way into the hall. The main dining room was empty now, though Jason could hear Charlie's and John's playful shouts echoing from the party rooms that extended off the main building. Left alone, Jason headed straight for the arcade. It was more dimly lit than the rest of the place, and without power, the arcade machines appeared as towering black monoliths in a forgotten graveyard. The air was stale and thin. Jason went to the nearest console and pressed a few buttons, some stuck with age, but nothing happened. "Plug it in, duh." He ducked behind the games to check, but even though the mounds of wires seemed impossibly tangled, it looked like they were plugged in. "Maybe there's a switch for the whole room?" He started checking the walls. There was no obvious switch, but as Jason scanned the walls, he became distracted by the children's drawings taped in clusters. Jason was too young to have any memories of his own from being at Freddy's. Even Hurricane itself was no more than a hazy set of impressions. But something about the pictures brought up a sense of nostalgia. They were all the same, really. The kinds of drawings he and every other kid had done. Figures with circles for bodies and sticks for arms, in a multitude of colors. Only a few details showed which figures were the animals. Chica with her beak, Bonnie with his ears. It seemed like there had been a bit more attention paid to the drawings of Freddy Fazbear. They were a little better. The children had been a little more careful to make the details right. Jason found himself looking at one drawing in particular. It was the same as the others, maybe a little better. Bonnie the bunny hugging a child. There was no name at the bottom. Jason took the picture off the wall, uncertain why this one in particular interested him so much. John burst into the room with a wide grin and a deep breath, but then, seeing that it was only Jason inside, he quickly returned to a stoic demeanor. "What's up?" He nodded his head, playing it cool, then casually stepped away before silently returning to a sprint. "Playing hide-and-seek like babies," Jason thought. "I hope I never fall in love." He looked back down at the drawing and squinted as though not seeing correctly. The child was now facing away from Bonnie. Jason stared for a long moment. Wasn't he hugging Bonnie before? He looked out at the main room, but Marla was out of sight, looking for the control room. Jason folded the drawing carefully and put it in his pocket. It was suddenly apparent how quiet it had become outside. Jason stepped out timidly and peeked into the dining room.
"Guys?" he whispered, looking back once, then ventured out to find the group.
Jessica, Lamar, Carlton, and Marla were still creeping slowly through the other half of the building. The spotlights from the dining room didn't reach this far, only accenting edges and corners or specks of glitter. Jessica scanned the wall with her flashlight, looking for breaks in the plaster, and motioned to Marla to do the same.
"We have to check for a hidden door," she said.
The last one wasn't really hidden, Carlton pointed out.
"Yeah,"
Jessica conceded, but she kept her light on the wall, clearly not ready to give up the hunt. They passed 2 bathrooms they had not noticed the night before.
"Do you think the plumbing still works?" Carlton said. "I really need to pee."
"What are you, 5 years old? I don't want to hear that."
Jessica rolled her eyes and walked faster. When they got to the room with the little stage, everyone stopped. Marla and Lamar went closer to the stage, drawing together slightly as if unaware they were doing it. Even though Carlton and Jessica had been here the night before, it was as though they were seeing it anew through Marla's and Lamar's eyes. They still had not seen what was behind the curtain, Carlton realized suddenly.
"I remember these posters,"
Lamar said.
"I remember this, too,"
Marla said, pointing to the sign that read "Out of Order" strung across the stage. "My whole life I've felt uneasy when I've seen that phrase, even if it's just at a vending machine." She laughed insincerely.
"I know what you mean,"
Lamar said softly, but before he could go on, Carlton interrupted.
"Found it."
"Maybe," Jessica amended. There was a door, close set into the wall like the one below the stage, not quite hidden, but not meant to be noticed. It was painted black, like the walls of the room. Jessica turned the knob and pulled, but it was stuck tight.
"Locked?"
Lamar said.
"I don't think so."
"Let me try," Marla said. She grabbed the knob and yanked, and it came open, sending her stumbling back.
"Impressive,"
Lamar said. "Yeah, well, taking care of Jason makes me tough." Marla grinned as she knelt down to squeeze through the small door. It was almost the same as the first room, a set of 8 TV screens and a large panel of unmarked black buttons. Carlton fumbled to find the master switch, reaching his hand into a dark corner. Then, with a click, the power came on, and a soft buzzing sound filled the room. Rich, bizarre reds and blues began streaming in under the door from the stage lights outside. Jessica and Carlton began switching the televisions on. They fiddled with the knobs until they were showing pictures, though most were very dark. From here they could see a long shot of the main stage, just as in the other room, but the rest of the cameras were showing other places and angles. While the first control room had only shots of the main dining room, here they could see into other areas of the restaurant. The private party rooms, which were set up with glittery decorations for events that would never happen, hallways, an office, and even what looked like a storage closet. The room behind them was visible as well, the camera trained on the out of order sign, now lit with otherworldly shades, and the curtain behind it. On one screen they could see Jason ducking back into the arcade.
"Maybe I should go get him,"
Marla said, but no one responded. Carlton started pressing buttons. Spotlights appeared and vanished on the stage in the main dining room as he did, illuminating first one animal and then another, lighting up empty spaces where someone might once have stood. He flipped a switch, and it seemed for a moment that nothing happened. Then Lamar started laughing, pointing at one of the screens. The pizza decorations lining the walls were spinning wildly, as though they might leap off and go rolling away.
"I forgot they used to do that,"
Lamar said as Carlton brought them slowly to a halt. There was a large black dial to one side of the buttons, and Carlton spun it, but it seemed to do nothing.
"Let me try."
Lamar said. He elbowed Carlton to the side and pressed another button. There was a high-pitched whine. They all jumped, and it quickly faded down to a static hum. Lamar pressed the button again, and the sound was gone.
I guess we know what turns the speakers on, Carlton said.
I bet we could figure out how to play the music, Jessica said.
She reached forward and pushed something else, and stage lights popped up while the main lights dimmed. The figures on the main stage suddenly stood out a little, commanding attention. She pushed it again, and the lights faded back to normal.
I love that, Carlton said.
What? Asked Marla.
Stage lights, he said. One switch, and it's like a whole nother world up there.
Another button flickered the stage lights on and off in the room behind them, while another started and stopped the little merry-go-round, its tinkling music grinding too slowly, like the ride itself was trying to remember how the song went. They managed to get the speakers on again without the feedback whine, but there was still only static.
I have an idea,
Jessica said, pushing to the front of the group. She switched on the static again, then started turning the knob back and forth. The hum grew lower in pitch, then higher, responding to her adjustments.
Progress, Carlton said.
It's still just static, Marla said, unimpressed. Jessica turned it lower again, then snatched her hand from the dial like she had been bitten and punched the button, shutting the speakers off.
What?
Marla asked. Jessica remained motionless, her hands still suspended in the air.
What happened? Did it shock you?
Carlton asked.
It sounded like a voice,
Jessica answered.
What did it say?
Marla asked, apparently interested again.
I don't know. Let me try again.
She turned the speaker on again, calling forth the static, and lowered the hum as they all listened, intent on the sound. As it sank to a lower register, just below the range of a human voice, they all heard it. Grinding in broken words, almost too slow and distorted to be considered speech. They looked at one another.
What on earth?
Marla said.
No, it's just random static,
Lamar said. He reached for the controls and dialed the pitch back up slowly. For another fleeting moment, there was a purposeful sound.
That sounded like singing, Carlton said.
No, Lamar said, sounding more unsure this time.
Do it again,
Marla said. Lamar did, but this time the static was empty.
Is that Charlie?
Marla suddenly became focused on a blurry figure moving down the dark hall toward them, sliding along the wall as though to remain unnoticed. Charlie was hurrying, almost skipping, and trying to find another place to hide. She glanced behind her, vaguely suspecting that John might be cheating. She moved through the darkness and toward the colorful glow of the small stage curtain, which was throwing eerie reds and blues onto the tables and party hats. Going down this passage had always felt like a long and perilous journey, one not to be made alone. She kept her gaze fixed behind her, letting the wall beside her guide her step. She knew John was close, probably creeping up on her in the dark. Suddenly, she backed into something, stopping short. She had been moving faster than she thought, or more likely the hall was not as long as she remembered. She saw his shadow at the end of the hall. If he turned his head, he would see her. Without thinking, Charlie climbed up onto the platform that she had bumped into and ducked behind the curtain, tucking herself between the wall and a large, bulky prop, trying not to breathe.
Charlie?
He called, still far away.
Charlie!
Charlie felt her heartbeat quicken. There had been boys she liked, now and then, but this was something different. She wanted him to find her, but not quite yet. As she waited, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she was able to make out the shape of the curtain and the edge of the stage. She looked up at the object in front of her. No. Her body shuddered, then froze. It was standing over her, It was the thing from her father's workshop, the misshapen thing that hung in the corner, shaken by random convulsions as its eyes burned silver. Does it hurt? Now it was still, and its eyes were blank and dull. It was staring straight ahead, insensate, and its arm with its hook hung useless at its side. She recognized his eyes, but he was somehow worse now, encased in hollow body parts and matted with red fur, with a stench of oil and glue. He had a name now. They called him Foxy, but she knew better. Charlie shrank away, pressing against the wall. Her heart was racing, and her breath was shallow, too fast. Her arm had been touching its leg, and now she felt a sudden itchiness from it, like she had been contaminated. She wiped her hand violently against her shirt as she began to panic. Run. She sprang away from it, pushing off the wall to get away, to move before it saw her, but the edge of the stage caught her foot. She stumbled forward, momentarily becoming entangled in the curtain. She struggled to get free when suddenly the thing's arm jerked up, and the hook slashed at her arm. She ducked away too late, and it cut her. The pain was shocking, like freezing water. She tripped backward and felt herself falling for long seconds, and then she was caught.
Charlie, are you okay?
It was John. He had caught her. She tried to nod, but she was shaking. She looked at her arm. There was a cut above the elbow, almost 4 inches long. It was bleeding freely, and she covered it with her hand, the gaps between her fingers welling over as her own blood leaked through. "What happened?" Marla asked, rushing up behind her. "Charlie, I'm so sorry. I must have hit a button that caused it to move. Are you okay?" Charlie nodded, a little less shaky. "I'm fine," she said. "It's not that bad." She moved her arm around experimentally. "See? No nerve damage," she said. "I'll be fine." Carlton, Jessica, and Lamar came hurrying out of the control room.
We should take her to the ER, Carlton said.
"I'm fine," Charlie insisted. She stood up, refusing John's help, and braced herself on the stage for a moment. She heard her Aunt Jen's voice in her head. "How much blood have you lost? You don't need to go to a hospital." She could move her arm just fine, and she would not bleed to death from this. She felt dizzy, though.
Charlie, you look like a ghost, John said. We need to get you out of here.
"Okay," she said. Her thoughts were scattered, and the injury hurt less than it should have. She took deep breaths as they headed for the exit, grounding herself. John handed her a piece of cloth, and she put it to the cut to slow the bleeding. "Thanks," she said, looking at him. Something was missing. "Was that your tie?" she asked, and he shrugged.
Do I look like a Thai person?
She grinned. "I thought it looked good on you." "Jason!" Marley yelled as they passed the arcade. "Move it, or I'm leaving you behind." Jason ran to catch up.
Is Charlie okay?
He said anxiously. Marla caught her breath and put her arm around him. "She's fine," she reassured him. They walked briskly down the same corridor that they entered through. Jason looked back as he was being guided out, studying the pictures on the wall once more before losing sight of them. The colored lights from the stage were fading, and the flashlight was throwing shapes and shadows on everything, making the drawings difficult to see. But Jason could swear he saw the figures moving in the pictures. They all hurried back through the empty building and out to the parking lot, not keeping watch for the guard. When they made it out to the car, Lamar, who had grabbed the big flashlight, flipped it on and shone it at Charlie's arm. She looked down at the cut. "Do you need stitches?" Marla asked. "I am so sorry, Charlie." "We were all being careless. It's not your fault," Charlie said. She knew she sounded annoyed, but she didn't mean to. Her voice was tight and clipped with pain. The shock had worn off, but that meant the wound had begun to hurt. "It's fine," Charlie said, and after a long moment the others gave in somewhat reluctantly. "We should at least get you some stuff to clean that up and bandage it," Marla said, wanting to do something to atone, however small. "There's a 24-hour drugstore just off the main road," Carlton offered.
"Charlie, why don't you go with Marla and I'll drive your car back to the motel?" Jessica said.
"I'm fine," Charlie protested half-heartedly, but she handed Jessica the keys. "You're a good driver, right?" Jessica rolled her eyes.
"People from New York know how to drive, Charlie."
John lingered a moment as Charlie was getting into Marla's car. She smiled at him. "I'm fine," she said. "I'll see you tomorrow." He looked at her like there was something more he wanted to say, but he just nodded and left.
"Okay," Marla said. "To the drugstore."
Charlie twisted in her seat to look at Jason. "Did you have fun?" she asked. "The games don't work," he said, obviously preoccupied. The drugstore was only a few minutes away. "You stay in the car," Marla commanded to Jason as they pulled to a stop. "Don't leave me out here," Jason pleaded. "I told you to stay," she repeated, a little confused by the fear in his voice. He didn't answer, and she and Charlie headed inside. As soon as they were gone, Jason pulled the drawing out of his pocket. He held it up under the faint lights of the parking lot to examine. It had not changed back. Bonnie the bunny was reaching toward a child who was facing away from him. Curious, Jason scraped at the crayon lines with his fingernail. The wax came off easily, leaving its trace on the paper. As soon as Marla passed into the fluorescent-lit, air-controlled drugstore, she sighed and put her hands to her temples.
"Oh, he's such a little brat," she said.
"I like him," Charlie said honestly. She was still using John's tie to stanch the bleeding, and now, in brighter light, she peeled it back to see the cut. The bleeding had almost stopped. It was not as bad as it had first appeared, though the tie was irreparably ruined. "Hey," she said, "how come you brought Jason anyway?" Marla didn't answer right away, setting her sights on the first aid aisle and heading for it.
"Here we are,"
she said.
"What do you think? Gauze?"
"Sure, but don't call me Gauze." Charlie leaned into Marla but was ignored.
"Antiseptic,"
Marla continued, grabbing the items.
"The thing is," she said, "so Jason's dad and our mom have been married since before he was born. I mean, obviously. And they're probably getting divorced. I know about it, but Jason doesn't."
"Oh no," Charlie said.
"They're fighting all the time," Marla went on. "And it scares him, you know? I mean, my dad left when I was still a little kid, so I grew up with that. I was used to it. Plus, I got to have a great stepdad. But for him, it's gonna feel like the end of the world. And they're sure not doing anything to make it easier. They're fighting right in front of us. So I didn't want to leave him alone with that for a week."
"I'm so sorry, Marla," Charlie said.
"Yeah, it's okay," Marla said. "I'm leaving in a year anyway. I'm just worried about the brat out there."
"He's really not a brat," Charlie said, and Marla grinned.
"I know. He's pretty great, right? I kinda like having him around."
They paid for the supplies. The clerk, a teenage boy, didn't bat an eye at Charlie's moderately blood-spattered appearance. Outside, they sat on the hood of the car. Marla started to open the bottle of antiseptic, but Charlie held out a hand for it. "I can do it myself," she said. Marla looked like she was about to argue, but she swallowed whatever she was about to say and handed Charlie the bottle and a piece of gauze. As Charlie awkwardly cleaned her arm, Marla smiled impishly.
"Speaking of people we like having around, are you having fun with John?"
"Ow, that stings."
"And I don't know what you mean." Charlie said primly, suddenly putting all her attention on her task. You do too. He's following you around like a little puppy, and you are loving it. Charlie bit back a smile. How about you and Lamar? She retorted. Me and who now? Marla said. Here. She held out a hand for the bloody gauze, and Charlie handed it to her, reaching for a clean strip. You're going to have to let me tape it, Marla said. Charlie nodded and held the gauze in place as Marla reached for the tape. Come on, Charlie went on. I see the way you look at him. Nope. Marla smoothed down the last piece of tape and put everything back in the bag. Seriously, Charlie said as they got back into the car. You're adorable together, and your names are anagrams of each other. Marla and Lamar. It's meant to be. Both laughing, they headed back to the motel. Chapter 5. When they got to the motel, Jessica was already there, and so was John. He stood up when Charlie walked in.
I was worried about you. I thought maybe I could sleep on the floor.
He waited nervously for her reaction, as though he had realized only upon seeing her that he might have overstepped her boundaries. On another day, in another place, Charlie might have been annoyed by his excessive concern. But here, in Hurricane, she was glad to have it. We should all be together, she thought. It's safer. She wasn't really afraid, but unease still clung to her like cobwebs, and John's presence had been a calming one ever since they arrived. He was still looking at her, waiting for a response, and she smiled at him. As long as you don't mind sharing the floor with Jason, she said. He grinned.
Just let me have a pillow and I'll be fine.
Marla tossed him one, and he stretched elaborately, set it on the ground, and lay down. They all went to bed almost immediately. Charlie was exhausted. Now that her injury had been cleaned and bound, the adrenaline of the night left her body all at once, leaving her drained and a little shaky. She didn't even bother changing into pajamas. She just collapsed on the bed next to Jessica and was asleep in seconds. Charlie woke just after dawn, when the sky was still pale and a little pink. She looked around the room. The others wouldn't be up for hours, she suspected, but she was too alert to try to fade back into sleep. She grabbed her shoes and, stepping over Jason's and John's sleeping bodies, went outside. The motel was set a little way back off the road, trees spread thickly around and behind it. Charlie sat down on the curb to put her shoes on, wondering if she could go for a walk in the woods without getting lost. The air was crisp, and she felt renewed and energized by the brief night's sleep. Her arm hurt, a dull and pulsing pain that kept drawing her attention, but it had not bled through the bandages. Charlie usually found it easy to ignore pain when she knew she was not in danger from it. The woods were inviting, and she decided to risk getting lost. As she was about to stand, John sat down beside her.
Morning,
he said. His clothes were rumpled from his night on the motel floor, and his hair was a mess. Charlie held back a laugh.
What?
He said. She shook her head. You look a little like your old self today, she said. He looked down at himself and shrugged.
Clothes don't make the man. What are you doing up so early?
I don't know. Couldn't sleep. What about you?
Somebody stepped on me.
Charlie winced. Sorry, she said, and he laughed.
I'm just kidding. I was awake.
I was going to go for a walk, she said, pointing at the tree line. Out there somewhere. Do you want to come?
Yeah, definitely.
They headed into the woods, and John hung back for a moment and surreptitiously retucked his shirt, trying to smooth out the wrinkles. Charlie pretended not to notice. There was no path, and so they made their way through the trees at random, glancing back now and then to be sure they could still make out the motel parking lot. John stumbled over a fallen branch, and Charlie reached out with her good arm to catch him before he fell.
Thanks, he said. Strong arm, too.
Well, you caught me yesterday, so it's only fair that I catch you back. Now we're even, she said. She looked around. The motel was scarcely in sight, and she felt concealed, made safe by the woods. She could say anything here, and it would be all right. She leaned back against a tree, picking idly at the bark behind her. You know Freddy's wasn't the first restaurant? She said it abruptly, surprising herself, and John looked at her quizzically, like he had not quite heard her. She didn't want to say it again, but she forced herself to. Freddy's. It wasn't my dad's first restaurant. There was a diner, a little one. It was before my mom left.
I had no idea, John said slowly. Where was it?
I don't know. It's one of those memories from when you're a little kid, you know? You only remember the things that are right around you. I remember the linoleum on the kitchen floor. It was this black and white diamond pattern, but I don't remember where the restaurant was or what it was called.
Yeah, John said. We took a vacation to a theme park when I was like 3, and all I remember is the back seat of the car. So, were they there?
His voice dropped a little quieter when he said it, almost reflexively. Charlie nodded. Yeah, there was a bear and a rabbit, I think. Sometimes the details get mixed up in my head. They're not like normal memories, she said, needing him to understand the story's defects before she told him the rest. It's like when you have a realistic dream, and in the morning you're not sure if it really happened or not. It's just impressions, little snatches of time. She trailed off. She wasn't explaining it right. She was choosing all the wrong words. She was reaching back too far in her memory, to a time when she did not yet speak. It was a time when she did not have the words to name the things she saw, and so now, when she tried to recall them, the words could never be right. She looked at John. He was watching her patiently, waiting for her to go on. She wanted to tell him this story from her life that she had never told. It was not even a story, not really, just something that nagged at the edge of her mind, something flashing by randomly in the corner of her eye. She was not entirely certain it was real, and so she told no one. She wanted to tell John, because she wanted to speak it to another person, because he looked at her with trusting eyes, and she knew he would listen to and believe her. Because he had cared for her a long time ago, because he had caught her when she fell, and he had come here to sleep and keep watch all night. And, thought a pragmatic, slightly cruel part of her, because he was not part of her real life. She could tell him this, tell him anything, and when she returned home, it would be as though it had never happened. She wanted suddenly to touch him, have confirmation that he was really there, that this was not another dream. She reached out her hand to him, and, surprised but glad, he took it. He stayed where he was, as if afraid that moving in closer would scare her. They stayed that way for a moment, and then she let go, and she told him the story the way she spoke it in her head, the memories of a small child mixing with the things she had come to understand as she grew older. There was another restaurant, rustic and small, with red checkered cloths on the tables, and a kitchen you could see into from the dining area, and they all were there together. Her father and her mother and us. When Charlie was very, very young, she was never alone.